be moderated by Professor Sakiko Fukuda-Parr, who's the Director of Program in International Affairs. Sakiko.
Well, thank you very much and welcome everybody. First we have Sam Moyn, who is the Professor of Jurisprudence and History at Yale, and he has been writing about the history of human rights and the historical role of human rights in the 20th century. Dena Freeman from the London School of Economics. She is a political anthropologist and she studies globalization, development, inequality, and democracy. And she does ethnographic studies of the politics of global policy making. So she watches people like Ambassador Sasha Llorenti, who is one of these people engaged in global negotiations and global diplomacy as permanent representative of Bolivia to the United Nations. Previous to being ambassador, was also a professor and also worked in various other organizations, ministries. He was, for example, Deputy Minister for Coordination with Social Movements, and he was also President of the Permanent Assembly of Human Rights. And finally, Mike Cohen will also be a speaker in this conversation. We are going to be talking about globalization in the 21st century. And over lunch, just before we came here, Dena talked about disaster capitalism. I think that while we are going to talk about our challenges are and what kind of future we are going to face in a world that is decidedly going to be global, when it is driven by an economic system of what we might call financialized neoliberal capitalism. And at the moment, I think we have got to a stage of hyper-globalization, a term that was used by Danny Roderick, the Turkish economist at Harvard, in his book Globalization Paradox. And he is referring to a situation where economic integration that creates a single market across the globe, that breaks down barriers of trade in flows of goods and services, and most importantly, capital and money, but of course not people, goes too far and is actually in a state that is in contradiction with the ability of national governments and people to manage the process in line with public priorities. So hyperglobalization is an impractical version of economic integration where institutions that actually make even markets work. So the trends that we're seeing today is basically the rampant rise of inequality. I just read, for example, that the world's richest man, Jeff Bezos, saw his fortune increase to 112 billion, which is just 1% of that fortune is equivalent to the whole health budget for Ethiopia, a country of 105 million people. And the increase in his wealth in 11 seconds is equivalent to what the lowest paid worker in his company, Amazon, earns over a whole year. We also see irreversible climate change leading to displacements. In 2019, in just the first 6 months, we saw 7 million new internal displacements due to disaster. So the question that I'm going to ask the speakers here is, what are the challenges and what kind of global governance will we need and will be possible to put in place in this era of hyperglobalization to assure a just and sustainable future? So let me start with Professor Moyn. So Sam, could you give us what you think are the key issues and the role of human rights?
Sure. First of all, thanks for having me, and thanks to Professor Fukuda-Parr for inviting me along. I'm a historian, and a question about what we ought to do stumps me. But I will make two remarks, one about globalization and the other about human rights, just to see where this conversation goes. So the notion of globalization, at least to the best of my knowledge, is about 150 years old, but it really became a watchword in the decade of the 1990s when I was a young person. And many of you who are students will really not be able to recapture just how hip it was to think you were living through globalization in the 1990s. It was a word that kind of marked the notion that at least liberal elites thought they were living through, supervising, at least witnessing the end of history. Now, we look back and it seems as if much of what ails us seems to have in fact been wrought in the 1990s. It turns out that globalization in the form in which it was institutionalized was a kind of neoliberal globalization. And the backlash at it that is occurring today, even as it's extended in other ways, seems to be roiling many places, the world as a whole. Just to be brief, I had started with a remark about the 1990s and the coming of a globalization that it turns out really was very restricted and selective. Call it neoliberal globalization. And remembering that even at the time, there were movements that called for alter globalization. So rather than thinking of more or less intense globalization, we should follow those old movements and ask which form of globalization do we want to construct in the aftermath of the shipwreck of neoliberal globalization as we've lived through it. So you might say in the slogan of that old movement, another globalization is possible, and the debate ought to be what are its features, including how much room for states and their power over their populations and the way they manage their markets ought to be part of globalization. So Professor Fukuda-Parr asked me to speak about human rights. If neoliberal globalization was presented as the end of history in the 1990s, that same period, human rights were presented as the morality of the end of history. And it was just a matter of getting the recalcitrant around the world to embrace human rights and respect them around the world. I'll just say, it seems to me the period since the 1990s has revealed the limitations of too exclusive a focus on a globalization centered on human rights. Not that anything's wrong with any item on the list of human rights, but especially when we think about the politics of distribution, who gets what, who enjoys what power, and who does not in hierarchies, and above all, who enjoys what income and wealth. Human rights have not led us astray, but given us insufficient tools to deal with neoliberal globalization. So just take two perspectives. One is the international distribution of power and wealth. Human rights essentially give us no perspective on that hierarchy. Even if you take these very promising concepts of economic and social rights, they're not totally useless by any means. They have many uses, but getting perspective on international inequality isn't one of them. And the scary thing is that this very promising concept of human rights is often about figuring out how poor states can take care of their own poor, not about adjusting the relation between rich and poor states, on which human rights, as of today, have no bearing. And then you take national or domestic inequality, which has risen in the very era that human rights became our predominant moral language in international affairs. If you want to put it disturbingly, you say that human rights are a language of the era of the victory of the rich. And that's not something we should tolerate. So why did that happen? Well, two brief reasons. First, most often we have preferred in our movements the human rights that are not about distribution at all, or very indirectly, rights like free speech, right not to be tortured. But even rights, a second, that do bear on distribution very powerfully, like the right to health or the right to housing, are about sufficient provision. They're about helping the worst off out of their destitution and penury. Human rights, however, don't provide any way of targeting the rich. They say nothing directly about inequality. They're about insufficiency, not inequality. And if that's true, then we need not to abandon human rights as a language that ought to be central to globalization, but invent a form of globalization that does take on these other distributional challenges, notably inequality.
A lot of very provocative thoughts. You know, human rights is in fact like a handmaiden of neoliberal capitalism, perhaps. The way that it has been used, not the basic principles. But let me pass on to Dena about your ideas about, you know, what the future brings.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you again for the invitation. I want to return to your opening remarks about the framing of globalization made by Danny Roderick. Because I think, as well as talking about hyperglobalization, he sets up what the real problem is here really, really clearly. Right? And he talks about that we have a trilemma, meaning that out of globalization, the nation state, and democracy, and we might like to think we can have all three of those, but he says we can only ever have two. And this is the fundamental paradox in globalization. And I think there's something very interesting in that. Let me just take a moment to explain why he says that, okay? So if globalization, meaning intense economic integration, that means essentially that capital can flow seamlessly across borders around the world. And whilst we might think that's the situation now, it's actually far from it. We're closer to that than ever before, but we're not all the way there yet. There is still friction at boundaries. It makes a difference doing business across boundaries, doing commerce across boundaries. In order to actually make that seamless, you would need to have the same regulations and the same rules and the same laws on both sides of that boundary, at least regarding commercial transactions. So in order to make that would happen, we would then need some global regulatory system. Now, if we had a global regulatory system, decisions are being made at the global level, not at the national level. So here we see the problem. If we have decisions made at the global level, and yet politics organized in states at the national level, we've lost democracy. If we want to take the decision-making up to the global level and perhaps democratize it, then we've lost states. And if we don't want to either lose democracy or states, then we have to give up on economic globalization. And this really, there's a very profound insight in this very simple trilemma. And I think that when we look at what is actually happening now, we see that the different, can you hear me better here or here? Yeah. the different players in the global, in multilateralism really, are taking different positions based on that trilemma. Okay? So we see that the North, capital, the elite, is pushing for the scenario of more and more intense globalization, economic globalization, and hence are indeed pushing for more global governance, for policy coherence, right? You hear a lot about this debates in international development and international finance about policy coherence. This is exactly what he's talking about. but they want to also keep politics at the national level, and so we're sort of losing democracy, right? Meaning that the ability of citizens in states to have a say in economic governance, and that is being eroded and eroded and eroded. Now, the countries of the Global South, particularly acting as the G77, in their various formulations at the United Nations and at other places, have actually been calling for something very similar to Roderick's second scenario, where we would have basically less intense economic globalization, but we'd have states and democracy, right? So there's, for the G77, national sovereignty is very, very important, okay? And democracy is very important. And they would like a sort of thin level of global governance, which they argue should be arranged more democratically than it currently is, and I would agree very much with that. But it's very similar to Danny Roderick's second formulation. And Roderick himself thinks that that's the way to go, right? That what we should do is, since we own all our institutions that deal with democracy and justice and redistribution and welfare and public goods, things that we want more of, are organized at the state level, we should basically move things back to the state level. I want to explore the third option, right? Because the third option says, let's take democracy and politics up to the global level. And I think this is really not discussed enough, right? Because then you think, what if we had, I don't know, some kind of global government, governance, world federation? There's many different formulations, but that somehow there's democratic decision-making at the global rather than, or as well as the national level. And this would open up the question and the issues that Sam mentioned now about what kind of globalization. Because think about the discussions that you have in most national parliaments. They're about, how do we want to organize our society? Right? Do we want this kind of right-wing, free market, liberal type of approach? Do we want a more left-wing, socialist, redistributionist approach? That's the core discussion in certainly most northern democracies. What would happen if we had that at the global level? What would a global left actually look like? Right? If we think of neoliberal globalization that we currently have as the global right, which indeed it is, it's a free trade, low government type of model. So what would a global left look like? You know, I mean, at its most simple, we can just sort of take what we think have at the state level and imagine it put at a global level. What happens if we had a global welfare state? What happens if we had global taxation and redistribution? These are things that are almost unthinkable at the moment, but why are they unthinkable? Right? Like, if we were serious about dealing with poverty and inequality, well, we've done that quite well at the national level in various places. Why not use the same processes up at a global level, right? Why not? We've had many people talk about, like Thomas Piketty, the French economist, talks about having a wealth tax. There are many proposals to have currency transaction tax. There are proposals to have various kinds of carbon taxes, climate taxes. There are many proposals out there about how do we actually redistribute wealth from where it is to where it's needed. Now, one of the key things in beginning to open up this conversation is to think, well, what institutions would we need? Okay? And what I see happening now with many of the social movements and NGOs, which many people call them the global left, right? Although they're not really the global left because they're not in political power, right? They're not governmental organizations, they're non-governmental organizations. So they're sort of outside, bringing suggestions, but they're not really sitting around the table with a vote. So we've got this strange situation where the global left is actually outside of politics. How did that happen? But if we look at some of their proposals, we see a lot of calling for new institutions. So if we look around the question, for example, of tax. Now, before we even go into creating new institutions for new kinds of global taxes, right, which would be much too radical to start with. What about just fixing the current tax system, right, where at the moment multinational corporations are able to sort of dodge through the loopholes and avoid paying taxes in very many countries, particularly in the global south, whereas the international discourse on taxation is all about increasing the government's ability to tax their citizens, again, particularly in the global south. So this is, again, what we're saying before, that we're going to have taxation and redistribution at the national level, but we're going to not look at multinational corporations and the capital and so on that they represent and allow that to go through the loopholes. Now, the G77, I'm sure you're aware, and indeed a large coalition of social movements and NGOs have said, well, we ought to have discussions about how to reform the global tax system at the UN, with everybody around the table, and let's make a new system. And the northern countries have resisted that and resisted that and resisted that, and instead had discussions at the OECD level, where they've come up with new suggestions that deal with certain problems of the tax system that are important to them, but of course ignore other problems in the tax system that are important to countries from the global south. But what we see is that the North want to say, we will make the rules and then impose it on the other countries, whereas what we see the South and the social movements calling for is, no, we need to have new institutions where everybody's making the rules together. We need to have a real democratic system, and then we will have a fairer distribution of resources. And I think we see the same things in many, many other places. So there's also discussions around how do we regulate transnational corporations, particularly with respect to human rights. And again, we see that the social movements and the countries from the south, particularly Ecuador and South Africa, calling for binding law on corporations, global law, and a global court, so that you can take transnational corporations to a global court. And again, the wealthy countries trying to separate it all out and say, no, we can't have that. Everything is international rather than global. We need to keep all these political things at the nation-state level and not bring it up to the global level. So I think it's worth thinking about. There's a question not only about what kind of globalization, right? What do we do with the politics of globalization? Do we keep it at the nation-state level? Do we globalize it? And if we globalize it, how do we globalize it? Thank you.
Very, very interesting ideas about what an alternative to globalization should look like by taking politics and democracy to the global level. Ambassador, any reactions to that and other ideas?
I'll try to exchange a few ideas about multilateralism. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions as well. But I think that there's a common understanding that we are facing different, a big set of challenges, big set of crises. When we open the newspaper, we see war in the Middle East. We see problems with poverty, hunger, obesity, disease, migration, discrimination, humanitarian crisis in different places of the world, catastrophes, crises related to water, for instance, or healthcare, etc. I think that when we see the history of humanity, we almost all the time we had those kind of issues. But now we have realized in the last 70 years that now we are facing existential crises that have to deal with humanity itself, that put in crisis our own existence as a species and life in the planet. One of those threats was nuclear war. It is still a threat, the possibility of a nuclear war. Now that threat is bigger than 3 years ago. If you see what's happening in the relationship between the US and Russia, and how both are dismantling all the infrastructure, the architecture that we have built in terms of avoiding that kind of war. So that's a threat that we new we had since 1945. In this century, in the 21st century, we realized that we have another kind of existential threat, which is climate change. That's the issue that we talk about every single day. It is a crisis the UN is trying to tackle. We'll talk about that a little bit later. There's another threat that's also, I think, existential, that has to do with the new technologies. That's something we don't talk about much. That's something that we are not ready to tackle. It has to do with biology, with the genetics, with artificial intelligence, with new rights that are being discussed. But that's also another threat to humanity. And as Sam was also saying, also the issue of inequality, and more than inequality, the way we produce, exchange, distribute, and consume, it's also becoming a threat to humanity, because our economic system is reflected by the distribution of wealth and, for instance, inequality. And you cannot talk about, for instance, climate change without discussing the economic system. Those are two things very much related. We can use as many paper bags as we want, or recycle each one of us as much as we are able to. But if we do not change the structure of the economic system, the way we produce, the way we consume, this threat will still be there. I'm going to give you a figure that's related to inequality. Did you know that the richest 10% is responsible for almost half of total emissions? The richest, and the poorest 50% is responsible just for 10% of the emissions. So I think that it has to do with how we are organizing our economic system. And I think it goes even beyond that, because the economic system doesn't come out of the blue. There are a set of decisions that make this economic system how it is now. But I think that the whole world is controlled by a global oligarchy. And I'm not using this word randomly or as a political stand, but it's really a handful of people who is controlling the political and economical future of humanity. What we were discussing right now about the G77, which is the biggest negotiating group at the UN, which gathers 135 countries. What we are seeing right now is the conscious dismantling of any form of political organization of states. In my own region, I don't know who are from Latin America or the Caribbean. Raise your hands, please. Okay, you know UNASUR, for example. It's dead. There's nothing there. You know CELAC, which is the Organization of Latin American and Caribbean States, is almost dead. Bolivia is presiding CELAC now. We are not able to deliver one statement on behalf of the group at the UN. It's paralyzed. Also the OAS, because it has been politicized. And not just in a regional level, also in the UN. The UN is not working right now. Of course, the United States is the main actor in international politics. Not just because it has the biggest military in the whole world, but also because they have 25% of the global GDP. So it makes it the most important political and economical actor in the world. But now, since the last 2 years, there's a systemic attack against the United Nations and the way it works. I'm going to give you a few examples. For instance, in the last century, you know, the invasion of Iraq, there were more than 1 million people being killed after that invasion, which is completely illegal. Then the war in Syria, what the US is doing in order to dismantle the International Criminal Court, the recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel against all the resolutions of the Security Council of the General Assembly. Not just that, but also putting an obstacle to peace in the Middle East. Then you know that the US withdrew from the Human Rights Council just a few months ago. Then they, along with some other member states, didn't participate in the negotiations for a global compact on migration. Also, talking about climate change, the US just withdraw their commitments to the Paris Accord. What's happening with the WTO? What happened with the Iran nuclear deal? That also makes that threat of a nuclear war even more dangerous, and many, many other examples. So here's my first question to you. This is the UN Charter. I know that most of you must be familiar with this document. My question is that this was adopted in 1945 here in San Francisco, and there was a standing ovation when the UN Charter was adopted. No? Do you think that this could be adopted now? I'm not talking about how the Security Council is with its 5 permanent members of veto power, no. I'm just talking about the principles and purposes of this charter. Do you think that we could adopt now these principles and purposes? I really don't think so. So one of the main tasks that we have is to make the United Nations great again. Because the only way that we have to tackle these global threats, because the ones I talked about, and I'm not the first one to mention them, of course. There's this Israeli historian that has, I don't remember his name right now, but anyways, you cannot face the challenge of nuclear war, or the disruptive technologies, or the climate change, or how our economic and political system around the world is organized without a multilateral system. That is the only way to solve those issues. But the dismantling of this organization is not, it doesn't come out of the blue, as I said. It comes from a conscious and very clear path to keep this handful of multi-billionaires holding economic and political power. Just one more thing. The second question is, the real thing that we need to ask ourselves also is not just which are the politicians that control our business, but who are the ones that are controlling those politicians. Thank you very much.
I think those last comments reinforced, I think, Dena's comments also, that how can you have a democracy at the global level when the power structures are so tipped in the hands of this, what you call the oligarchy, which is essentially the largest corporations in the largest countries in the world, that are making the rules of economic integration, economic investments, trade, and so forth. So this other globalization, it seems to me, is not really possible without grappling with the fundamental problem of redistribution of power, which Sam mentioned. So the last word goes to Mike to comment on all of this.
Thank you. I think that the previous 3 sets of comments are very compelling and very disturbing, but I'm going to make them worse. Because I think the issue that's not fully out on the table is the question of urgency. We're not in a situation of equilibrium where we're in a relative balance where things can keep going on. Because now the climate scientists have told us well, we have 10 years, we have 15 years, we have 20 years for different sets of outcomes. So the real issue is how fast can we address them? How do you even frame the questions in ways that can be addressed in the short term in order to be able to address the question of disequilibrium, right? And so I think it's a question of political urgency. I mean, hearing Sasha's comments, I found myself thinking about the U.S. election and saying, well, this really isn't just the U.S. election. This is an election that has broad global consequences, and we in the U.S. need to realize that, and I'm not sure we do, but I think this is a big point. So I want to talk about two parts of this which are very urgent. Sasha referred to the question of consumption and use of the material world. And so we now know that the way we produce and the way we consume is not in equilibrium, right? So the idea that we're going to change behaviors around consumption, we're going to change our ways around production, we're going to think about radical words like regeneration and reuse and all of these things, these are actually become central concepts. And so the question of how we think about that and what kind of concrete things do we do? And then the question comes up, who does? When we talked about, in the earlier period about globalization, there was a debate in the 90s, for example, would countries become more similar or more dissimilar through globalization? And there were these books which we now can look back at and think is sort of science fiction, like the world is flat. Well, the world certainly is not flat, right? The world has very steep inclines and slopes reflecting wealth and concentrations of power. We see that there are many differences in the world which are very important, which have become, I think, more important. So it takes me to the question of the local, and the idea that if we're going to do something about climate change and we're going to translate this into political institutions and ways of thinking about this, we've really got to understand the role of the local in this. And I think the local solution to climate change, what is done in Mumbai is not going to be the same thing as Miami or Buenos Aires or Jakarta. And yet they're all facing a problem which comes out of this collective disequilibrium. So the question then becomes, what is a sensible solution at the local level, on which local level? The numbers of the fact that the latest IPCC report saying that there are 136 cities, over 5 million, which are on the coast. So we know at least 1 billion people will be affected as sea level rise happens. Who's going to move? Anybody here going to move? Where are you going to move? How far? Who do you imagine is going to move? Your grandchildren are going to move? Your children are going to move? How much time is left? Where are they going to go? Nebraska? Detroit? Where are we going to go? There are all kinds of questions like this, which actually are relevant questions. I remember laughing at the fact after the hurricanes, the Superstorm Sandy here, when people apparently were selling apartments in Tribeca to move to New Jersey because it was safer. Sort of a little bit of a canary in the coal mine. But what's the next storm? And when do people begin to move? And if Trump really is a real estate guy, why doesn't he understand that this is the biggest real estate thing ever going to happen, right? And so he might take advantage of that. But it seems to me there's urgency, there's movement. This is not a stable situation. And so I think a lot of the questions that were raised by my colleagues here need to be placed in a very dynamic framework, in a time-bound framework. And then the question is, I think, to what extent can politics, can people, can mass movements and organization actually contribute to change?
Thank you. So I think we want to have some conversation here and also conversation with the audience, a lot of eager hands. I do want to ask one question. In a sense, I mean, we've come full circle with Dena saying, we have to move the politics to the global level and imagine a different kind of globalization with different kinds of global institutions. But Sasha reminds us that there is a systematic dismantling and systematic incapacitation of any kind of multilateral collective action within the institutional frameworks that we have. And then, so then Mike is saying, you know, it's so urgent, we have to act, and the action has to come locally. Do you have a quick response to if global level politics is still possible, or do we abandon it?
Well, any of you?
This has been so interesting. I love Dena's proposal. I think my one reservation about it is that we don't seem to have adequate global institutions for the kind of democratization that you envision. The United Nations was never adequate. Even in the days when the G77 could propound a new international economic order and call for global equality, it was stymied because the United Nations was originally the name for a military alliance of a small group of superpowers. And the system remains bound to those origins. The problem is not recent pushback. So I think we have to kind of look back and see that there was this period of urgency after the Great Depression when there was a reformism of fear, and what it involved was that the moneyed elites globally gave up some of their power out of fright. And they gave it up to nations and national governance, not to global governance. And that worked for a while. I agree totally, it would be preferable to live through this period and see a global democratization. But it seems as if what's actually happening is the right, not the left, is winning because it seems for voters to have persuasive modes of national pushback against neoliberal globalization. So I would conclude from this that the left needs to work at both of these levels and figure out what is its national program, as well as how can it build from the acquisition of national power in various places to do better this time and build a better kind of global governance than the United Nations ever represented.
Dena, you want to defend the global democracy?
Certainly. But just to say at the beginning that obviously when I talk about a global democracy, I don't mean that everything goes up and we have some centralized democratic government at the top and no decision making further down. Obviously I'm talking about a multi-level system, so there will be still some decision making at a state level and likewise at municipal level and so on and so on and so on. So just to sort of bear that in mind. But what I feel is that at the moment, the bit that's missing is the global level, right? So that's why I want to focus on that. And I think that Sam's comments about the left are indeed true. I mean, the left, if you look back into the sort of history of left thought, right? So initially the workers' movements in the 19th century were actually international. Right? This was at the time of the, when the nation-state system, the international system was still crystallizing, and it was very clear to workers that labor standards in one European country, if they got improved, but in another European country they didn't get improved, there was gonna be a race to the bottom anyway. So the early labor movement was, international, sort of perhaps not fully global. They didn't think too much about the countries that were colonized at that time, but they certainly weren't limited to a nation-state thinking, right? But in the compromises that happened after the First World War, and particularly the Second World War, the ability to have institutions that promoted justice and that promoted welfare and so on took place at the nation level. And so what happened was that the left basically became fundamentally nationalized. Okay? And so I think it's something that needs to happen now within the labor movement and left movement, is to think, what is a global left? And I mean global and not international. Right? And I think it's a whole new area of thinking that needs to happen. And just about how on earth do we make these things happen is I fully acknowledge that this is a power struggle, right? It's not exactly a class struggle because there's also a north-south element to it as well as a capital labor element to it, but it's the sort of 21st century globalized version of the struggle that happened in the 19th century between capital and labor at a national level, right? And it's a struggle, right? How did we get democracy in nation states? By, well, I mean, historians have many views about this, but at least partly by protests, by strikes, by demonstrations, by revolutions, by threats of revolutions. Okay, the 19th century was a busy century. So it didn't just happen by us asking for it, or for workers just sort of making a proposal and thinking this would be a good idea. And I think that possibly we have to bear that in mind, right? The struggle that we are going to go through now, if we want to make a just and democratic world order, is a struggle. And it's a power struggle. And exactly how we go about that, I think it needs to be discussed, but I raise it because I don't think it's on the table. I don't hear people saying this that often. So, yeah, that's my thoughts on it.
Sasha.
Yes. There are some days that I wake up and I'm optimistic, and some others that I'm not really. Today I'm not very optimistic, really, because if you see history, and Sam could help us out on this, all the major, achievers, so to put a name, that are the most important historical moments in the build-up of the multilateral system, came after huge crises, after wars, the Peace of Westphalia, for example, or the Napoleonic Wars, or World War I, World War II. So I'm pessimistic because it seems that only after a big crisis we will come to our senses for a while. And that crisis might be climate change. Really. It could be. Or the possibility of a nuclear war, which could seem crazy, but I think that crazy is becoming, I think we need a new word to describe what's happening, really. That's one thing. The other thing is that, of course, the United Nations was never perfect. It did have some achievements during the last 17 years. The whole human rights architecture, for example, is one of those examples. But at the end of the way, it's the only thing that we have now, as with organization, with structure, with knowledge, with institutions. Imperfect, of course, but it's the only set of institutions that we have that could help us a little bit in order to face the challenges that we have. And the last thing that I want to say is that there are good examples of things being done around the world. And allow me to talk about my own country just for a couple of minutes. Bolivia is facing one of the most important moments in its history. Bolivia was one of the poorest countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, next to Haiti. 30 years ago, almost 40% of the population was extremely poor. Not poor, extremely poor, 40%. And now it went down to 15%. Life expectancy grew 10 years in the last 10 years. We have reduced inequality like no other country in the Western Hemisphere. We have reduced child mortality. Bolivia is number 17 in gap gender in the whole world. 17. And many, many figures like that. How did it happen? It's because we took control of our natural resources. The main export of Bolivia is gas, natural gas. 13 years ago, 82% of the revenue of natural gas went to the oil companies. 82%. Just 18% for Bolivia. The rest for Shell, total, Repsol, you name it. What we've done is we nationalize our natural resources. And now 82% is for Bolivia and 18% is for the oil companies. And they are still in the country because they are still making a lot of money. And most of the money goes to finance these social programs, build infrastructure, try to solve our structural problems. So I think that's an example of what can be done. Same thing with Brazil under Lula da Silva. Same thing with Argentina under Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner. So there are different models in order to solve this issue.
Well, I think it's very interesting, this struggle that is continuing, and I think the struggle takes place in different fora and in different ways. That what you're talking about is a country taking control over its own natural resources. The trouble is that these oligarchs that you talked about are writing the rules of the global economy, and there is this thing called dispute settlement mechanism and ISDS, that where companies are allowed to sue governments for legislation such as plain packaging of cigarette, right? With a warning sign that says cancer kills, and Philip Morris takes you to court for depriving them of their profit. This is an actual international agreement, right? This actually happened. In the case of Philip Morris, they lost, but it has this chilling effect on countries putting in place such public policy, public health legislation. But so, you know, this issue of economic power, I think is not something that you can struggle against, but I think it's a struggle that continues. So Mike, do you want to comment on the global issues? You talked about the local, but on this whole issue of the possibility for a more democratic global system.
The first thing I would say is that it's not clear to me that you're going to solve the big problem at the highest level. It may be that you solve a big problem by addressing it in many different spaces at the same time, which we could call local or national, or so if there were, you know, one to many more Bolivias, you know, in its own terms, improving its situation, that represents something significant. It's really questionable whether the global will be able to get its act together. Some of us in the room may remember when Gordon Brown came to the New School about 7 or 8 years ago and gave an impassioned talk up on the 7th floor about how we needed to have much more multilateralism. And it seems like sort of a relic because the situation's much worse now than it was then in terms of our hopes. So I think there's no question that the global is going down, the local perhaps is ascending. The local ascension needs to be accelerated and multiplied enormously, so that maybe we need another word other than globalization, which is referring to the mobilization or something which is much more action-oriented. I just make one sort of summary observation. I think that this whole conversation and the questions demonstrate the importance of really thinking horizontally across disciplines, across time periods, across sort of paradigms and problems, because I don't think we kind of have the time to solve one little problem at a time. I think we've got to think about how it all fits together. And I'm sitting in this room and thinking of classes I've had in this room, I'm thinking that actually we're going to bring it back to the university question, that this idea of thinking horizontally and understanding policy and analysis and design as a basis of action here is something that I think we've got to take a hold, not so much, well, certainly as an academic pursuit and endeavor, but also as a political one, because I think that the way we think about these things in the end will really determine whether we're going to find our way out of these problems or not.
There are many things I want to say, but the first I think is that, of course, there's a common saying that says act locally and think globally. I think the repercussion of what we do locally is very, very important. I'm not going to talk about any specific country because, according to the UN Charter, I cannot interfere in domestic affairs of other countries. But you know, if you choose politicians that will defend your interest, the interest of the people, instead of these multinationals, that will have repercussions all the way up to the global sphere. And I think there are so many things to change. If we talk about, for example, the financial system, we talk the IMF and the World Bank, they have almost the same structure as 70 years ago, with a handful of countries controlling the whole decision-making process. You know, but that's unfair. That's one of the things we dealt with G77. You know, that the United States has not just veto power in the Security Council, but almost veto power in the IMF, for instance. So if you don't get along with this particular country, you will have problems both ways. You know, so that's, I think, we have a structure that if we be more democratic, it will work more in benefit of everyone. There's need for reform in the United Nations. There's need for reform in the security branch, I mean the Security Council. There's need for reform in the World Bank, in the IMF, and also the creation of new institutions, new agenda, new also international law. We were talking about, for example, disruptive technologies. Another one thing that I found out is that the president of Microsoft, I don't know his name. The president of Microsoft, what's his name? Yeah. You know what does he has in common with Syria and Iran? One thing, that they both agree on having a Geneva Convention on cybersecurity. There's a need for an international framework to protect civilians in case of cyber war. And we are so far away from that now in the UN. For the first time, there is an open-ended working group on cybersecurity that has started to work at the UN a couple of months ago. We're not talking about 10 years ago or 20, no, a couple of months ago. So from that, getting to a new Geneva Convention on cybersecurity will take decades. So there's a lot to be done. And I think on disruptive technology, if I may, just one more point. As we were talking about natural resources, I think the conversation during the following years and decades will be the data resources. And I think that there will be movements in order to nationalize data or to recover data for individuals. You know, I think that's going to become a movement, because right now they are profiting out of our data, but not just profiting. They are shaping our lives. They're shaping our futures, but they are shaping also the decisions of our politicians. So that's as a struggle for land 500 years ago, or the struggle for technology in terms of machines 100 years ago. The struggle for data will be one of the most important in this century. And the last thing regarding your question of left and right, I can talk about the Bolivian experience. One of our main exports is gas, but it's not. We are not. Our main income doesn't come from extractive economies. We have managed to diversify that. It's very difficult. And what I would like to ask you, when we talk about things like climate change or economies, that you cannot look at the realities of countries such as mine through the eyes of what's happening here, you know? Because there's another figure that's very, very, very interesting. We will need 4 planet Earth, the resources of 4 planets, in order for the whole humanity to consume as an individual here in the US. Imagine that. There is no enough resources on Earth to, if we all consume as people here in the US. And the gap, the inequality in terms of material benefits is so huge that the way that Europe dealt with the economical and financial problems after World War II was through the Marshall Plan, to a huge amounts of money invested in Europe for the reconstruction. If that same plan could be used in Africa and Latin America, then we will be talking about something else. Sorry.
Thank you. Yes. The inequality of consumption, I think, is one of the big things. So, Dena, 1.5 minutes.
Yes, I'll be very brief. But just to speak for a moment as an anthropologist, which is what I am and is normally the outsider in these kinds of global discussions, because anthropologists often look at the very, very local. Are there any anthropologists here in the room? A small little minority. Okay. But I want to imagine, right, if we think of how the old classical kind of 1950s British social anthropologists looked at societies in various parts of the world, right? They would go off to somewhere in Africa or somewhere exotic and different, and they'd look at the way that exchanges are organized and how rituals are organized and the political ritual systems. And often the analysis in showing how it worked and why it was like that would show who it benefits, right? They would often show, because they're doing this is the way that local elites appropriate labor from the local youth, say. Okay, there's a lot of classic anthropological analysis like that. So I want to imagine that I am an anthropologist from Mars, and I'm coming here to look at Earth. And I'm looking at the global political economy. And I'm seeing a globalizing economy, right, with increasingly open markets and capital sloshing around across borders. And yet I'm seeing a political system which is resolutely staying at the national level, with people saying we can solve things locally. And I'm looking at this system of global economy and national politics, and I would think, well, who does this serve? What's the implication of the system being like that? And I think my conclusion would probably be very similar to what Ambassador Llorenti said, is that it serves the interests of a global oligarchy, okay? Because if you have politics democratized and globalized, that's a way of limiting the power of the powerful, right? That's what democracy, when it works, that's what it's supposed to do. So if we have lots of arguments and say, no, let's keep that at the national level, but let's keep the economy at the global level, that's a fantastic way of keeping the economy out of any democratic control. And that's what we have now. So whilst all the questions raised here about how do we make sure that the democracy at the global level wouldn't lead to a global Trump, and what kind of democracy, should it be this kind, that kind, should it be more participatory, should it be what? These are all good questions, but they're the next set of questions, right? They're the details of how to make it work. To me, the fundamental thing is we need to have this kind of democracy. Otherwise the world is going in a really, really bad direction, right? All of the problems that we're facing are global, whether it's climate, whether it's technology, all right, as well as the economic issues, they're global. And if we stay trying to sort it out in our little villages, they're laughing at us. So that's what I think.
Sam, you have the final word.
I also want to address the question whether global governance incurs the risk of an even worse tyranny. The fact is, it's already happened. There's really no, I think, choice on offer between sticking with the local and saving the United Nations that doesn't acknowledge that we've lived through a globalization that has built unaccountable power outside the United Nations, indeed outside governance. It's not just the IMF and the World Bank, but regimes like intellectual property, investment, trade, all of which rule us. And so I think the only solution that I see is this one of reconstruction, but it could only happen through national pushback, at least in its initial steps, and eventually the reconquest of the global, which already governs in a series of tyrannical ways.
Well, thank you so much for all these comments. I think we're all going to go away from this panel thinking hard, maybe changing our minds what this was all about. Thank you so much.